In the spirit of one concept at a time, on to the next one. This one is, well, it's not quite resentment. You might notice the two S's. It's a Franco-German twist on it, one that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche really first brought to the fore. Ressentiment. It is a little bit more than resentment. It is richer. It denotes quite a bit more psychology, and it is specifically a term that was used that was pretty apt in the time, because as you might recall, this is Marx had already come on the scene and had left an impact, and I think Nietzsche had to, in effect, unpack a lot of what he saw developing in the world and what his problems with it were in society in general and in philosophy in particular. And in so ressentiment. So it's a French translation of an English word, but its root is from Latin, and it has two parts. The prefix re is again, to do again, and sentir, to feel. So think of it as feeling again. So recalling a previous feeling and living it over again, much like sentiment of resentment. You recall a certain interaction and negative feeling that gave you. Resent. You tend to live in the past and resent that action, or you tend to attribute different negativity to it. But but this is just the surface. It has a number of other dimensions. One, it deals with a sense of hostility directed at that which one identifies as the cause of frustration. So whatever you're blaming for your frustration, there's a general hostility directed at it. There's an assignment of blame. There's also a hidden sense of weakness or inferiority complex, and perhaps even jealousy in the face of this cause. And it generates your desire to reject it or to justify it some way. No, I didn't like that bitch anyways. I don't care. What do you mean she turned me down? I didn't like her anyway. She was ugly. That kind of thing. Morality which attacks or denies the perceived source. So in many respects, it is so abhorrent to you that you can't stand that it hurts you, so you want to make it disappear. So you will attack it morally and deny its existence even. A value system used as a mean to justify one's weakness, by painting the source of envy as objectively inferior. So again, making the thing that you envy or the thing that you resent seem inferior, seem painted in an inferior way. Say, well, she's nothing. I don't care about her. That kind of thing. It's also obviously a defense mechanism. It prevents the resentful individual from addressing and overcoming their insecurities and flaws. So it is both a defense mechanism and an enduring barrier, because until you deal with it, you can't address your issue. And of course, it's an enemy created by the ego in order to insulate yourself from being the source of culpability. So again, the ego never wants to let you hit yourself, so it'll create an enemy for you to hit. So as I said, Soren first introduced it, and Nietzsche expanded on it. Sartre also commented on a similar concept. He termed it bad faith, but it was roughly similar, blaming one's failures on external factors and denying responsibility for things. René Girard took a different spin on it. He sees it as the price to pay for turning the other cheek. So in effect, when you're confronted with something in life, you have two choices. You confront it, you take it head on, or you turn the other cheek and simply take the damage. And if you turn the other cheek, the resentment is the price you then have to pay. That's what you will feel for not having stood up to rival or to the scapegoat or to whatever the reason was that. But let's drill into the words of both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, because they are expressive. So this is what Soren says. It's a fundamental truth of human nature that man is incapable of remaining permanently on the heights of continuing to admire anything. Human nature needs variety. Even in the most enthusiastic ages, people will have always liked to joke enviously about their superiors. That is perfectly in order, and it is entirely justifiable, so long as after having laughed at the great, they can once more look upon them with admiration. Otherwise, the game is not worth the candle. So he speaks of the human nature of having to belittle that which is to, whenever we have sort of a meta figure that we are sort of in a position to look up to, there is a human reaction as to not want to face the fact that they are so, that the other one is so much more advanced, so much further out of reach, so much beyond the capabilities of ours, that we would rather put it down. Well, yeah, he's a great basketball player, but look at him, he barely can, sink that whatever. Or, the typical quarterback, the Monday night quarterback sitting in the armchair, the person who feels entitled to offer political advice to newscaster on how the president should do the job, that kind of thing. So there's always an element of that. But then Kierkegaard points out that as long as once you're done laughing, you still can recognize the fact that, they are superior and they should be admired. And if you lose that, then the game is not worth the candle. Then you kind of lost the script. Continues. In that way, Ressentiment finds an outlet even in an enthusiastic age. And as long as an age, even though less enthusiastic, has the strength to give Ressentiment its proper character and has made up its mind what its expression signifies, Ressentiment has its own, though dangerous, importance. And this is where he gets into sort of the pathology of it, the part where it gets dangerous. The more reflection gets the upper hand and thus makes people indolent, the more dangerous Ressentiment becomes, because it no longer has sufficient character to make it conscious of its significance. It can no longer detect itself. I think this is the first sort of deep observation part, because when you begin to belittle, when you begin to discount, when you begin to kind of offhandedly dismiss that which is admirable, that which is far greater than your capability, very soon you begin to forget, you begin to lose perspective that you're actually resentful. You begin to believe what it is you're saying, and that becomes dangerous. Bereft of that character, reflection is cowardly and vacillating, and according to circumstance, interprets the same thing in a variety of ways. It tries to treat it as a joke, and if that fails, to regard it as an insult. If that fails, dismiss it as nothing at all, or else it'll treat the thing as a witticism. If that fails, then say it was meant as moral satire, deserving attention. If that does not succeed, add that it was not worth bothering about. And this, you'll find, this is basically the most true about resentment, and not being able to identify the fact that you're basically justifying to yourself the inability to accept something. But you'll find this in embedded ideological views when you see two people debating, and when one perhaps receives some words that he wasn't expecting, some things that cut too closely, you'll find that basically justifications begin almost involuntarily, to the point where even the body will kick in and find ways to not hear what is being said. I've seen this time and time again in debates, but there is a deeply embedded resistance to accepting a deeper fault that one might have. This becomes very quickly a moral failing that is nearly impossible to detect. Ressentiment becomes the constituent principle of want of character, which from utter wretchedness tries to sneak itself a position, all the time safeguarding itself by conceding that it is less than nothing. So this is you begin to get like the traditional narcissistic traits, where you'll loudly attest to the fact that you have no knowledge, meanwhile expressing to yourself that you're an expert. And say, but I told you I don't know anything about it. Well, I didn't speak about that, but why do you keep telling me? And I don't care what you're saying, blah, blah, blah. So while yelling that you are nothing, you in effect hold yourself far higher than your opponent. The ressentiment, which results from want of character, can never understand that eminent distinction really is distinction. So not being, this is the famed Dunning-Kruger effect. When you're ignorant of something, when you don't know something, it'll seem a lot simpler to you from a distance because you have no knowledge of it, and you're more eager to dismiss it, more likely to dismiss it. And yet, that's in that moment you fail to distinguish between eminent distinction, meaning true expertise, true superiority, to true betterness of skill, versus just distinction. So something that you can distinguish, you really can't gauge the size of the distinction. So that's the difference between eminent distinction really being distinction. That is what defines distinction, being eminent in that trait. Neither does it understand itself by recognizing distinction negatively, in the case of ostracism, but wants to drag it down, wants to belittle it so that it really ceases to be distinguished. So whatever it is that the ego is unwilling to accept, it'll try to tarnish, it'll try to make not exist, it'll try to make not important, it'll try to make not something that he should be judged on. Ressentiment not only defends itself against all existing forms of distinction, but against all that which is still to come. And this is a very, very prescient observation. You might be familiar with this concept of conspiracy theories. They're often described as being totally completely encompassing. They encompass any argument. So no matter what argument you have, the theory rises up to basically beat it down to the point where you can't win. There's no argument outside of its domain. So similarly, this Ressentiment will tend to have a defense for all of the voiced criticism and all of the unvoiced criticisms yet to come. And from that perspective, again, this is yet another mental defense mechanism that allows it to burrow in and not get itself discovered and recognized. So as you can see, they're speaking of a very deep psychological state of mind, not simply just the brief feeling. Now Nietzsche, he came at it very differently. He saw this as originating from faith, from Christianity and from Judaism. Some blame him for being anti-Semitic because he blames, the Jews because it originated in the Torah, and he also blames Christianity for sort of smuggling this concept in, not and basically covering for it. But in effect, the way he saw it, he saw Christianity as necessarily a morality of the weak, a slave morality. Its goal was to gain favor amongst the slaves. So he focusing on ancient Rome, for example. Christianity was having a hard time because obviously it wasn't going to make much inroads with the aristocrats, the nobles. They already had a healthy pantheon and whatnot, whereas the slaves were much more prone to be converted. So therefore, and this is Nietzsche's complaint, is that to do that, it inverted the world's values. So all of a sudden it started preaching that the wretched alone are the good, the poor, the impotent, the lowly alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are the pious, alone are the blessed by God. That was his principal complaint, and he felt that this was its built-in flaw, its defect, and that it was going to have an outflow of corruptive effects in the future. And he turned out to be right. He predicted almost to the year the coming of the Second World War, and sort of predicted its reasons. Not from a socio-political aspect, but from a human defect aspect. So he goes on to say, I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity, the one great instinct of revenge for which no means are poisonous enough or secret enough. I call it the one immortal blemish upon humanity. Christianity was from the beginning essentially and fundamentally life's nausea, disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as faith in, quote, another or better life. Now these are pretty harsh words. So I felt I should leave them there so you understand where it comes from. And also, when he puts this together, this is more towards the apogee of his life. So he may have felt a little bit more curmudgeon-y and more entitled to have himself a yelling contest at God. But he goes on to actually describe now Ressentiment as it begins to inhabit the person. And in this, he does this in his book, The Genealogy of Morals. And he uses this example of priests and knights. And these are a little bit different than his original introduction, because there's no longer a slave morality, but rather the priests and knights are both inhabiting a master's world, right? They're both in masterful positions. But, and this is where I think he succeeds in explaining the difference, that it can exist at any and all level. It isn't simply the weak. It isn't a question of the genuinely, the slave. You would see that the slave would have a genuine beef at being, oppressed and resentful. But this, he begins to paint a picture between two elements of high society that should, by all means, feel pretty good about their position. So first, the man of ressentiment desires to lead a certain kind of life which he deems valuable. The priest, a member of the nobility, values a life that includes political supremacy. This is what the priest wants. He sees the knights, more physically powerful, achieve this power. He then comes to recognize his complete inability to fulfill this aspiration. So he just recognizes, he sees them grasping for power, he sees them getting power, and he sees their qualities. And not either through assumption, either through recognition, not sure, but he now sees that, okay, he's not physically powerful, therefore he will not be getting this power. He becomes inhibited by his weakness or impotence. Yet he retains his arrogance, his lust to rule, and his will to power remains intact. This combination of elements drives the priest to repressed vengefulness over the perceived loss of status. So this now begins to paint the picture of the genuine ressentiment, which is a person of significant power in a significant position looks at another whose quality, whose set of skills, whose qualifications are completely different. And rather than acknowledging that the difference is merited, he looks at it and simply sees it as a slight on him. And that's an element you'll see kind of come back as we talk about others. The priest will reason. So now this is what the rationalization kicking in. The priest will reason that the knight is of lower intellect, of lower piety, of lower morals, or in some way undeserving of the power the priest desires. This allows the priest the moral expiation to plot and to scheme, and when the opportunity arises, to act against the knight, condemn him, judge him, and sentence him to gain his supremacy. So now you begin to see sort of the underhandedness, the sort of lack of principle, and the corruptive effect this has. Because the priest sees himself as the victim and has convinced himself that the victimhood is just because this person was unrightfully or undeservedly gaining what was rightfully his. So by simply being there, this person's functioned as an oppressor. So you can see the gaps in this line of thinking and morality. Now, brings me to Karl Marx, because I think we can see sort of how this, in large part, I think it was Marx's a general commentary and popularity that caused Nietzsche to kind of react to some of this. And so let's analyze it. First, let's just remember some of the key elements from resentment. There was an element of the objectively inferior versus the objectively superior. So there was something that was better than something else. It was a meritorious difference. It was there, it was measurable, it was objective, it was not subjective. And then we see the phenomenon of inversion of values being brought in by subjective points of view. So from your perspective, that which is superior is actually not superior, it's inferior, it's sinful, it's not pious, whatever. So you can begin to see the pathology of misplacing the blame, not recognizing that this is a shortcoming of yours, but rather, pushing it onto someone else, and all of a sudden it skews your worldview. Now, the attribution of false defects or traits, and that's simply a tactic. The deception of the intent, the subversive nature of the attack, so this person doesn't come at you fully. It basically, he works in the corners, he works in the shadows to basically bring you low. And then, of course, the general lack of principle, and most importantly, the inability to recognize the lack of principle. Because the actor in this believes themselves to be principled, to be the victim, and to act from righteousness. So let's talk about Marx. Now, it's important to know a little bit about Marx because Ressentiment shines brightly throughout his life. He was born in a middle class family. His father was an attorney, fairly successful, who was also some means of an educator. He educated Marx privately until it was time to go to college. He sent Marx to the University of Berlin to study law. Marx got there, sucked at it, then decided that he was going to study Hegel and write. And basically, this was the Geist of the times. There was quite a bit of unrest. The Industrial Revolution was taking place, so being a reactionary was fashionable. His father had himself been a reactionary for a short while. He helped introduce the Constitution to Prussia. And he was in circles. In his circles, there were some, let's say, liberal aristocrats, or aristocrats who were of noble descent, but nevertheless had more liberal views. So Marx was very much accustomed to this as a circle and being sort of in the rarefied circle of the intellectual. But from a purely academic, discipline perspective, he failed at Berlin. He went to University of Bonn, tried to put his thesis there, failed there, went to a University of Jena, which is like Chico's state equivalent. And he got it there. And then he started writing for a paper, incurred the local wrath of the authorities, had to flee to I think Brussels, Paris. Eventually he ended up in London. In any case, he had always been a man on the outs, so to speak. He met a baroness. She was of noble birth, and married her. She was the daughter of an aristocrat, again, liberal views. But throughout his life, he basically was near in the circles of aristocracy, but always broke, always owing money. So even when his mother died and left him some modest inheritance, it immediately went to paying off previous debts, and he incurred more. He never really had much truck with the proletariat, the factories. He never visited one, never liked the working folk. He just had this concept of this intellectual. This eventually Bakunin actually describes what he saw out of Marx. He called him vain and perfidious, and said that he had this concept of the new class, which is proletariat lack what he called a class conscience. So they weren't capable of ruling themselves. So it was up to the subset of the intellectuals, him of course included, to provide that benevolent guidance for the proletariat. So you can kind of begin to see how this tainted him. And I think money was a huge importance to him, because although he is the classical example as at the anti-capitalist, and usually the accusation fielded to capitalism is it is material, it saps away your humanity, blah blah blah. His entire psychological approach is to gauge history, interactions, power relationship, absolutely everything. He gauges it through one filter: materialism. So he is as material as the most inveterate capitalist. In fact, he tends to discount almost all other aspects of the capitalism that are positive. The supporting of arts, the religion, whatever. All of these aspects he thinks nothing of, and it's materialism that should be the sole surviving qualifier for gauging a situation. But let's talk about his use of language and kind of how that was left with us with a nice injection of his personal ressentiment that contaminated me. First, although the word capital was used, and capitalist was used, although briefly, I've only been able to find a couple of instances before really Marx popularized it. It was well understood that capital was, in fact, available monies. But his use of the words capitalist and bourgeoisie were a bit charged. First of all, his description of what capital was the first step in alienating this capitalist class out of the society he saw. He described the proletariat as those who engaged in labor, commanded labor, their jobs, their work. And then he described capital as really the embodiment of other labor. And he implied, or he expressly said, that the capitalist had acquired it in somehow illicitly. And in doing that, he really drives a wedge between what really is a contiguous piece of the population. Because let's kind of think about the time he's talking about this. Not too long before this, the average common, lowborn non-aristocrat had little chance of elevating himself in society. With few exceptions, you know, hardly ever would that happen. In the Middle Ages, in the feudal times, you know, the best ways you could earn a living outside of just being a serf and a farmer was, you know, take up a sword and become a soldier, maybe a squire, maybe eventually a hedge knight or a knight. But very few would be able to elevate themselves. And then as the age of discovery came, and, you know, more ship-bound voyages, more trade, merchants became more and more common, and they were usually from the common folk, and they could elevate themselves to a position of wealth. And now, because of trade, because of raw goods, because of the need to transform said raw goods into manufactured product, that really gave the impetus for innovation and industrialization. So now here comes Marx in the midst of what really is the second industrial revolution. I mean, originally in the 1700s, factories sort of started, but there was less. There was more the need for manufacturing as opposed to having the full means. But by the mid-1800s, the steam engine is there. So coal-fired steam engines are available for you to create motive power in large factories. So people are going crazy, securing capital, and taking a risk and building factories. And what by this definition of capital, what Marx divides the fact that many of these capitalists were in fact laborers. You know, the capital was basically the accrued labor of one's family for generations, and or basically the accrual of some horrendous risk that they've taken throughout the ages, and the loss of this capital would be disastrous to them and would return them to their original position of poverty. So there really wasn't as deep of a divide between the capitalists and the proletariats, because there still existed aristocracy and there still existed the sort of historical privileged. But he didn't have a problem with them. He envied them. And you can see by some of the words that he uses. So capitalist is one of these words that basically in public can be used a functional term, but in revolutionary circles, it depicts sort of the top hat wearing, you know, ruthless, devoid of all emotion man who basically will, on his way to the bank to collect his profit, will stomp over the bodies of emancipated children. That's the vision, right? He also uses the term bourgeoisie, which was yet another sort of semi-derogatory term about, you know, yeah, he might have been a common-blooded person at one time, but he answered the call of the burg, the city. Now he hobnobs with the rich, and he has forgotten his roots, and, you know, he's really doesn't care about where he once came from. That sort of thing. But at the same time, these other words come into usage, and they're commonly used by Marx in his circles. This is where you begin to see the formation of the left-wing elitism. These were words that were not created by the left-wing intellectuals, but they were rather borrowed. And it's the source that kind of tells you what it is that they envy and they want, because they were borrowed from the aristocracy. And the words I'm talking about are nouveau riche, parvenu, and arriviste. So nouveau riche was a word that the aristocracy had already coined to, in effect, have a sort of simple way to tag the people of wealth that have now begun to penetrate the higher circles of society that didn't come from, quote-unquote, old money. They weren't of title. They weren't of the blood. They weren't blue bloods. They were just simply new money, nouveau riche. And that was basically the least, let's say, derogatory of the three, because it just simply was a nice little way to signal, you know, with a little, you know, nod and smile that he's not a noble, but he's rich. Parvenu is a little bit more derogatory. Parvenu is a person who has reached the financial levels of the aristocracy or even exceeded them, and now is actually diligently attempting to fit in. So he is attempting to behave like a gentleman. He's attempting to speak in a certain manner, to be couth and cultivated and all that stuff, right? But unknown to him is that he is being observed by the genuine blue bloods, and they are basically derisive of it. They're laughing their asses off at this idiot's efforts to mimic a true aristocrat, because all they know, and this is where the word comes in, you know, it's obvious that he's a parvenu, because his his defect is that he is common born, and that's nothing. There's nothing he can do to eliminate that deep character flaw of being common, irrespective of effort. And so now the difference between parvenu and arriviste was, whereas a parvenu is really being obsequious and really bending over backwards to actually seem like, to try to fit in like an aristocrat, an arriviste is very boisterous, is very much, he is here and he announces himself as being here, and he isn't so much looking for your acceptance of his fitting in, and he will announce his fitting in. He has an opinion, it's usually an informed one, and it's usually a loud one, and he tends to behave sometimes, couth, sometimes less couth. And although it is also a term derogatory, sometimes more derogatory, it's spoken in lower terms, in lower tones, lest the arriviste would hear, because he also has a hot temper. So these are the words that the noble would use to define the rich yet not yet noble. And it is curious that now the intellectual, this new class that Marx and his compadres styled themselves in, and mind you, they are not wealthy by any means, yet they see themselves as having this higher, more rarefied sensibility of the world, in which they can use the same terminology to distinguish themselves as if they were the old blood from these new parvenus. And that's when you begin to see the elements of this elitism, this intellectual elitism, not necessarily warranted, not necessarily based on true skill, true intelligence, true actual capability, simply as a decision that one group of intellectual takes to hold themselves apart from another. And it just by happenstance, or probably by reason, Marxism now becomes the core of a whole slew of very interesting varieties of ideology that spring, into fascism, into communism, into Fabianism, into socialism, into a variety of areas. And they culminate today in what we know as the cultural studies, the critical theory, the intersectionalism, all that stuff. And they've not only maintained these original Ressentiment characteristics, but they've amplified them and refined them. Now, although I'm being very derisive or critical of Marx, because I absolutely think that his grasp on economics and his grasp on functional political theory was poor, he actually had an amazing grasp on what I would term asymmetric tactics of conflict, understanding how to find the weak spot of a hegemonic structure or of an existing power structure and really strike at it. And where he stumbled upon it, and he made he taught a number of people, and he convinced a lot of people, and he was able to use his emotional manipulation in describing the situation into getting a lot of converts. These converts, to the degree that they too were intellectuals, they've been able to refine these tactics, and now the tactics are truly formidable, even though the underlying assumptions are completely wrong and fail reality. And that's the true danger, because now we're left with Ressentiment being a horrible source of a number of sentiments, or a number of observations about society that are completely wrong, but yet emotionally grounded, that make a vast number of our society feel that they're right, feel that they know, feel their way through any sort of rational debate. It isn't uncommon today to hear a debater, and then when questions go, when the question segment comes, the typical contrarian will say, "Well, I can't help but feel that when you said that," right? And that statement should be struck at its face, because it doesn't matter what you feel about the facts that were shared. They're simply facts. You should be able to have processed them and rationalized them and thought them through and logically asserted them. But feeling them now has taken the place of logically proving them. And that has become sort of a very powerful, influential tool. Now, I also noticed some elements, if you paid attention to the Ressentiment, because these elements of this behavior now, we've had the benefit of time. We've had some terms come out of psychology, some terms come out of a theory, but there's a lot of terms that actually describe specific behaviors and sometimes specific pathologies that are like codified in the DSM. So things like projection, paranoia, narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy, mania, these are not out of place when describing Ressentiment. So the typical behavior for a narcissist, for example, and this is just a sole person's view of themselves. I'm not talking about the other derivation, which is group or induced narcissism or onset narcissism, but rather just simple narcissism. The typical projections would be, the person believes themselves to be superior. He tends to only associate with others that he believes are of his ilk or of his rank. He tends to be disdainful towards others, dismissive of opinions, or dismissive of anyone's particular, validity. Therefore, shows relatively little empathy. And then when sort of on the straights, he tends to project and accuse the opponent of what he himself is doing. You'll notice these tactics come out in society quite a bit in terms of political dialogue, cultural dialogue, things of that nature. Because there is another aspect to narcissism, which is group-induced narcissism or group rapid onset narcissism, which is if, for example, let's say that, climate is something you feel very passionately about, and you've been convinced that feeling that way about it is a virtue. And you're surrounded by a group who feeds you this information continuously rewards you for being virtuous in this aspect, or being anti-racism, anti-whatever, pick your ism. But you have a circle that feeds you this praise, which in effect elevates that piece of you as narcissism. And in many ways, it becomes the caricature trope of the nerd that basically hangs out, through some accident gets popular, and all of a sudden ditches his old good friends and hangs out with a whole bunch of bad new friends and gets in trouble and does all these things, and then has to have the full sort of rediscovery cycle and come back to his friends. Well, minus the last part, you see this behavior manifest everywhere in social justice circles, activism circles, radicalists, those type of people. So the element of this ressentiment, something that was defined 200 years before, has become very much alive and well. And I think what I'll do next is I'll probably describe critical theory and sort of how it all relates to one another, because you'll find that it's exactly similar, irrespective of the oppression that it involves. So with that, if you like it, comment.